Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. This is the garden question and answer video that I do most Sundays, although this past week there was one on Monday and one on Tuesday. I went out to California last week, wasn't feeling well during that period of time, and then when I came back home, same thing. I had sick for about 9 days, and so finally getting better here in the last 48 hours. I'm shooting this on Friday. You're seeing this on Sunday. There are also a couple other videos on the channel this week of just some of the things that are in flower right this minute, some of the things that are really showing off in the garden. There's an autumn lilac encore azalea that was in yesterday's video back there. You can see how that's probably my favorite encore azalea, honestly. And what else? Let's think. There should be something up on the Learn to Garden video series, which is linked down below this video. I intend to have content going up the entire year on that video series. And so those of you who have purchased it, I really appreciate it. You'll continue to get new additional content, all year long. And those of you who have not, if you want to consider it, it's linked down below the video. So we're going to jump right into some questions here. These were questions that were asked on Monday and Tuesday's Q&A videos. Somebody asked when to fertilize azaleas. And so going back, several weeks ago, I put up a video on the channel about fertilizing all of my shrubs, perennials, trees, everything. I just do it once a year at that, as the soil temperature is just starting to warm up. I put the video up a little bit early every year, so I'm definitely earlier than probably most people would be fertilizing, but any time now would be fine. Some people say that you don't fertilize azaleas until after they bloom because you can push a lot of new growth on them and potentially cover up some of the flowers. I don't know. I don't know if any of that's true, but I'm not using any kind of synthetic fertilizer that's really gonna push the plants anyway. I'm just using an organic fertilizer. It's gonna be slow to act in the spring because the soil temperature's cool. And it basically feeds the soil microbes, and the microbes are what feeds your plants. That's what you're doing when you're using organic fertilizers. And so it's not gonna push your plant in any way, shape, or form. So anytime is the answer. I wouldn't throw fertilizer over open flowers. I'll sit out here and sling fertilizer before anything's really flowering. I wouldn't want to sling fertilizer into, open flowers on things because it might discolor them or shorten the life of the flowers. But anyway, spring fertilizing azaleas, organic fertilizers are what I generally recommend folks use. So somebody asked in general, they got an Acanthus. I think they were in zone 8. That's Bear's Breach. There's a couple. If you're following along with the channel, there's some Acanthus back here in the back garden. They get these flower spikes on them about this high, and all parts of it are wicked. Like the flowers have thorns, the stems have thorns, the leaves have little modified thorns on them. They're kind of interesting. But Bear's Breach is the common name for them. They're in zone 8, wanted to know where to place it. I would put it in a little more shade the further south you go. So if you're in, these are hardy in zone 5 to 10. So up in zone 5, they're full sun plants if you want them to be. And down here, by the time we get to 8, I've got good light on them back here, but they're in they're in the afternoon shade. So that's the place to grow your Acanthus. So somebody asked about how to initially space plants, because I've talked about planting thick and then editing later, taking plants out, moving plants, rearranging plants when they get too large for the space. So I'm spacing the shrubs the appropriate distances apart. So if a plant says it gets 3 to 4 feet apart, most of those shrubs are going to be at least, they're 3 feet apart back here or 3.5 feet apart. And then I'm filling in with perennials and annuals and those kinds of things. So things that are much easier to edit later. But the shrubs themselves are spaced. If you look at the width of the plant, I'm probably on the narrow side. So if a plant gets 3 to 5 feet in width or 3 to 4 feet in width, I'm probably closer to 3 feet just because, again, I'm planting things a little bit tighter in here. But you could go wider. The point about planting tight and editing later is that I want ground covers near them. I want the roots shaded as much as possible. Root shading is important. I even talked about it in the video that would have gone up yesterday about clematis. Clematis love to have their roots shaded and the top of the plant in the full sun. There's lots of plants that prefer that. They want cool roots and hot tops, you know, and so we plant clematis planted out there. One of them is planted in some rocks. You know, it's literally it's in between some boulders planted down in the ground, so the roots are never going to be hot on that one. And then the other one's got annuals planted around it, or one of the other ones that I showed off, Henry Eye, has annuals planted around it to keep the roots cool. So lots of plants like that prefer their roots to stay cool. And then again, your annuals, you just choose not to replant them if you don't have space as the shrubs are getting bigger. Your perennials will get pushed out by the shrubs anyway, in all likelihood, or you can dig them out and move them later. So my spacing on my shrubs is appropriate really for the sizes they get, although I'm probably to the inside of, you know, the 3 to 5 or 4 to 6 or whatever widths. I'm probably closer, you know, I'm on the little number instead of the big number in terms of my spacing, just because this lot is so small. So somebody has their hosta coming up in a different color than it was when it went to sleep. So it got transplanted or something, and then it got slammed by a frost, and now it's coming up a different color. It may just come right back out. You'll see a couple things. Number one, sometimes on those hosta, you'll see them come up. Some of the variegated ones will come up a slightly different color than they're ultimately going to be. Maybe they're more a vivid yellow as they're coming out, and then they fade a bit. You know, the variegation fades into a creamy white, that kind of thing. So they are changeable, okay? And then number two, not all of the variegated hosta are completely stable, you know, meaning that they can revert to whatever they were a sport of, because a lot of them are just variegated sports of other varieties. So it might be a variegated sport of a blue hosta. So it's within the realm of possibility. If it took enough stress, it could go back to being that blue hosta. So there's that too. So it's either one of those things, it may be that you get additional pieces coming up of the original, you know, what you purchased, or not. Maybe it's just reverted back to whatever it was, but they're not all 100% stable variegations. Okay, and you'll see that in a lot of variegated plants. You'll get green pieces coming out on them, you know, where the variegation is not 100% stable, or you'll see lots of different variegations on the same plant. Okay, let's see. Somebody asked about underplanting red buds that they think are in too much sun. So they've planted their red bud out in the sun, and they think that it's going to end up again in too much sun. And that's another plant. This is a great example. Red buds are a great example of a plant that likes to have cool roots and the top of the plant be in the sun. And if you ride along the interstate, you know, Interstate 40 runs through Raleigh, North Carolina, over to Greensboro, heck, all the way to California. If you're riding along the interstate, is where you're going to see the red buds is right on the side of the wooded areas, so that they got their roots planted down in the woods a bit, and then the top of the tree is sticking out into the sun. And so you're right to want to shade the roots on one that you've got out in a lot of sun. And so you can, while it's small and it's not really shady, you know, if it was a big red bud, I'd have, you know, shade suggestions, but you probably need sun suggestions. So you can use, you know, things like sedum. You can use summer annuals, like some of the dwarf zinnias that I showed in the zinnia video from a couple weeks ago. So really any low growing, sun tolerant thing that you want to put under it'll be totally fine. And then it'll edit itself as the tree starts to shade the ground. Okay, so somebody has a young Japanese maple and they have branches on one side. How they want to know how to get branches over to the other side. You're going to have to do a little bit of pruning on one side of it. This is Japanese maple back here, Tomukiyama. If you haven't seen it, it's got a stem that I bent years ago. It's a pretty interesting tree. But I always feel like with a tree, I'm 100% in charge of how it's ultimately going to look. And so I don't mind at all taking a little bit, pruning a bit of the limbs on one side of it to force growth on the other. It's no problem to hold back one side a bit. And it just, you only have to go back 2, 3, 4 inches on a stem to hold it back. You don't have to go butchering the one side of it to get the other side to grow. You can just take off just a little, just give this one side just a bit of a haircut on each of the ends of the stems, and that'll hopefully slow down that one side enough to get the other side to catch up some. They also said that the stem on it, the trunk is very thin, so that will also help with that. By slowing the tree down some, hopefully you can thicken the trunk up as well. But don't be shy. pruning a healthy, vigorous plant like that. Just you don't have to go to town on it hacking it. Just stop the growth on each of those branches on the sides you're trying to slow down. Okay, somebody has a cleared area, and the plants that are closer to the wooded space that's remaining struggle. Well, that's the same thing in this garden. It's the exact same thing. As I get closer and closer back here toward the wooded lot that's behind me that's never been developed, the harder it is to grow things. And it's not just really the shade issue, it's those tree roots are pretty tough on them. So what you need to know about planting, what I've done back here is I've watered more, and that's what I had to do. So the things that are planted out this way, the further from the woods, closer out there to the street, the less I've had to water things. So the things that are on the back line, I've got Pieris and Acuba and Elysium and Mahonia and hellebores, really, really drought tolerant things that have struggled back there to compete with the tree roots that are in the back. But they broke through this past year. I've got a rhododendron back there, really, really struggled against those tree roots. It's in the perfect space, it's in the perfect amount of shade, it's in the perfect soil, it's in the perfect everything, except for the tree next to it's trying to kill it. So you just have to give them more water. So you're going to have to know that as you progress toward that wood line, it's raining on me now. It's going to require a little more water. Okay, and I'm not going to be able to see my writing because it's going to smear it. Okay, so somebody has an area that's got some bunkers basically in it and wanted to know if they should regrade the entire space as their landscaping. If you already have existing landscaping out there, I'm probably not going to go to all that trouble to completely redo a space like that. I lost 120 trees in Hurricane Fran at the old house, and all of those stumps did not come out of the ground. So, it was me cleaning it up. By day I was going and landscaping for folks and, who had 3 trees down, and, it was like the end times. And then I'd come home at night to a really destroyed space. I closed on the house 3 weeks before Hurricane Fran, and then had 120 trees drop that were 6-inch caliper or bigger. So that's what I am counting as a tree. There were other things that were smaller than that, but 6-inch caliper or bigger, 120 plus trees, up to things that were this, big. And so I'd come home every night and cut them down. I didn't pull all those stumps. And so I ended up with some settling in places in the garden. I just used that contour to my favor. If there were wetter spaces out there, I used some native plants like clethra and oak leaf hydrangeas and other things in some of those lower spaces, and I just went with it. So it's up to you, but again, I didn't want to completely redo that whole area and pull all those stumps out. Didn't have the money at the time. I was 24, 25 years old, so and just used every penny I had to close on a house 3 weeks before that. So okay, I get tons of questions. Well, okay, so there's a question before that. Somebody asked about an upright narrow holly for the corner of their house. They've seen one called Arrow Point, which I think is a Monrovia one, and then they saw Needle Point. Were those good choices? Yeah, those are good upright narrow growing hollies for the corner of your foundation. I really like Oakland as well, and I've got golden Oakland back here in the back garden, and then the green Oakland. Just grows super, super narrow without having to do any pruning on it. I think I'm going to move this up on the porch because it's a full-on rain now. The temperature's in the low 40s as I'm filming this. It's supposed to be, this is on Friday. I think Saturday night it's supposed to be 39, and Sunday night it's supposed to be 38. So I'm bringing in tomatoes, bringing in peppers. None of that stuff's gone in the ground yet. No real threat of frost or freeze, but boy, that's awfully close here in the as we're coming up on into the second week of April at this point. So let's see. Again, Oakland holly is a really good one for a corner foundation. I don't really like to use Nellie Stevens. A lot of people do. It's probably the most common of the upright hollies, and it's good for screening, but it tends to grow more pyramidal. Like the bottom of it tends to try to get wider, whereas needlepoint will grow more vertical, and same thing with Oakland. And oak leaf is another one if you can't find Oakland. I get tons of questions about leach field planting. So planting over, if you have septic system, where your leach field goes out, planting over that. I mean, there's hardly a week goes by that somebody's not asking me what they can plant on top of it. At my house, at the old house, the only thing I planted on my leach field was typically annuals. So my vegetable garden was there. I had annual flowers there. There was one of the questions this week about the leach field was about using ornamental grasses. I definitely wouldn't use ornamental grasses. If you've ever seen how deep ornamental grasses can root, it's kind of astounding. I mean, there's photos of roots that are 5 and 6 feet down in the ground from ornamental grasses. So they can be quite aggressive. Probably one of the last things I would that I would use. Of course, the very last thing would be like a maple or a birch or a willow. All of those notorious trees for being aggressive rooting. But again, I just planted annuals. It was my spot that was my vegetable garden, so that way those plants come out at the end of the season. So there's no way that they're going to root down into my septic system, damage my septic system. Plus, I was raising the soil up just a bit above it. I'm not recommending you plant anything over it. I'm not liable for anything, but I used annuals over mine, and that way I kind of knew that I wasn't causing any permanent damage. I could just pull those annual flowers out, pull my peppers and zucchini and squash and all of those things, and my lettuce in the cool season, that kind of thing. Okay, somebody wanted to know the best way to mulch when they can't dump the mulch on a hard surface. So when I dump it on a hard surface, I've shown this many times, I use a snow shovel or a grain shovel. Some people call those shovels. And it's really easy on a hard surface to get a pretty big scoop at one time. Once you dump it on the grass, you're pretty much going to have to use some sort of fork. So some sort of manure fork is probably ideal. It's probably best to test a few different forks and see which ones work best for you. But a manure fork works pretty good for me in the past. I try to dump it on hard surfaces where I can. It makes the work so much easier to use a shovel off a hard surface rather than a fork off the grass. Just from lots of experience on that. If nothing else, I would try to put a tarp down, and then dump it onto a tarp. It still won't allow you to use the shovel, but it'll certainly be easier to clean up out of your grass, or, unless you're dumping it into a space that's going to be a bed. Obviously, you wouldn't need to do that. But if you were dumping it into a turf area, you might want to see if you can put down some sort of barrier so you don't have to get it out of your grass. It's going to kill your grass very quickly because it's hot. It gets really, really hot down in that mulch pile if you're not moving it quickly. Somebody has an area along their street, and dogs are urinating on their plants, and they were looking for things to use. They've got some blue fescue out there now, and it just immediately dies from any dog pee. There are a lot of plants that are incredibly sensitive to dog urine, and a lot of our ornamental grasses are great choices for it, and then some are very poor choices. So you need to look up anything you're using. I talked about most anything in the Lamiaceae or the mint family are generally very urine tolerant or salt tolerant. You're looking for salt tolerant plants, and so we had a job, did a landscape job, like a 5-part landscape job. I think it was like part 3 where we talked about in that video from the fall about plants. She has a very large dog, pees on every corner he gets to. So we were using nandinas, Indian hawthorns, rosemary. We had a lot of plants there planted specifically for target plants that we knew wouldn't be damaged by urine. So you might want to go back and take a look at that video. Russian sage is a good one. That was actually on their list of things that are planted out there. Russian sage is, on the is a good one for you. Somebody asked me if they had just gotten back from Biltmore, wanted to know if I had ever been to Biltmore. Yeah, I've been to Biltmore many, many times, up in Asheville, George Vanderbilt's old house. kind of a crazy place up there. If you haven't been, the gardens are amazing. I don't know how many acres the entire property was. I know it was 125,000 acres when Vanderbilt originally bought the property. I don't think it's anything like that now, but there's about 30 acres of actually really high-end gardens there, and the Italian garden, the shrub garden, the walled garden, all beautiful. Olmsted designed them, same person who did Central Park in New York City. So and they must have been an interesting pair, because I think George Vanderbilt was probably 26 years old or something when he started on that project, on that house. If you can imagine having that kind of money at 26 years old. And Olmsted would have been probably in his 60s or something about that time, because I think it was 1888 or something when that house was commissioned, and Olmsted was born in like 1822, I believe, if my memory serves me correctly. So they would have been quite a pair working together. Olmsted would have been almost 3 times Vanderbilt's age at the time that they were building the house. But the gardens are incredible. The house is incredible. The whole thing is opulence on its on the highest level. But yeah, I would love to go up there and shoot it. So at some point, it's on the list of things that I'd like to get on camera for the channel, for sure. So somebody asked about taking cuttings from dwarf grafted plants. So if you had a dwarf apple and you took cuttings on it, would you still have a dwarf apple? Probably, in all likelihood. There are cases where there are full-size plants grafted onto dwarf rootstocks, and that's what's dwarfing the top of the plant. Then you have plants where it's a dwarf plant, but it's grafted onto a full-size vigorous plant, and it makes a slightly larger plant than the dwarf would have been on its own. But most of the time, you're probably going to get a dwarf tree on a dwarf rootstock. I'm sure that's probably what they're trying to match up there. So it's going to depend on plant to plant, in all likelihood, whether or not it's still a dwarf. But more than likely, yes, it's still going to be the dwarf cultivar. Let's see. Somebody has a Florida Sunshine Elysium, and it's very floppy. Mine was too when I initially got it. There's a lot of just horizontal growth on it, and then the new growth that happened last year was more vertical. I don't know why it was initially floppy like that. I don't know. Maybe the cuttings that were taking off of it were cuttings that were, going in this direction, and that's what I ended up with. But yeah, mine had this weird flat bottom on it that was maybe 24 inches tall, and now it has vertical growth. I've had to cut some of that vertical growth to let some more catch up on it. But initially, a little strange how it grew. Somebody went to one of the box stores in Zone 8B, and there was a Heaven Sent Jacob's Ladder there. They wanted to know if it would grow there, despite the tag saying it's Zone 3 to 7. I doubt very seriously it will do well in your area, even in a shaded space. The heat's probably going to be too much, and my guess is a lot of people in Zone 7, like I am, probably couldn't grow it either. But it is a Zone 3 to 7 Jacob's Ladder, and that's the thing. And I get to ask that question all the time about why something has a top. They understand the cold part of the zones. So if I say something is hardy in Zone 7 to 9, well, logic tells you it just gets too cold in Zone 6, and the cold will kill it. But why won't it grow in Zone 10? Some things that are listed for Zone 7 to 9 probably will grow in some places in Zone 10, but typically it's because they need they need sleep. They need to go to sleep for some period of time. They need some sort of dormancy. The intensity of the light, that far south, could be different. There's just lots of evolutionary reasons why a plant won't take, into more tropical areas. It seems like everything would want to go toward the tropics, but that's just not true. Where the plant evolved, has a lot to do with that. Let's see. There's a ton of questions across the board on, my plant looks dead. Should I give it more time? Yes. I mean, I'm still a week before my average last frost date. I definitely have some perennials that haven't popped up yet. I'm still expecting to see a few more. I'm sure I've lost a few, but that cold was really nasty in December, and I'm sure I didn't really lose any shrubs, but I definitely have lost a few perennials that aren't coming back yet. But I'm going to see a few more before it's over with, and so I'm going to go at least another 2-3 weeks probably. It's usually sometime in May before I give up completely on things. Let's see. So, and then another one I get a lot this time of year is my butterfly bush is only coming up right from the very bottom of the plant, or my hydrangea is only coming up right from the bottom of the plant. Those are another one I'll give a couple of weeks to see if any of the wood a little higher up in the plant is still alive. Because remember, it warms up at the ground before it warms up, 6, 8, 10, 12 inches, 18 inches above the ground. And so you are initially going to get that growth first. It might be that some of the stems are still alive a little further up. So before I start cutting those things down to match where the growth is coming out, I'll give it a couple more weeks. Once we get to that point, you can go ahead and take that dead wood out, down to just where the pieces are coming up out of the ground. There's a lot of questions like that. There's also lots of questions about plants that just stretch too much. Somebody pointed out there Asclepias tuberosa always gets too tall and then flops over. I don't know if things are getting enough sun where they're growing, or if they're getting plenty of sun, and that's not the reason they're stretching and then flopping over. Are you pushing them too hard with fertilizer so that you're stretching them, so that they end up flopping over? Really, the only thing I have to stake in this garden, and I don't have enough sun for some of these things for sure, but my dahlias I always need to stake, just because that's just the nature of these hybrid dahlias and how they've been bred to just get 6 feet tall every year. But most everything else I have, I really don't have to stake it a whole lot, but I'm not pushing anything at all. So that would be one thing that I would throw out there, is just, not over pushing them, not over composting them, not over, so I'm wondering if that is, or again, are they just not in enough sunlight and they're just stretching out and flopping over? It wasn't just Asclepias, it's other questions too about perennials, coneflowers, and other things that just get way too big and then flop over. So again, I'm really careful in how, just not pushing things. Let's see. So somebody asked me, where is my Empress of China dogwood planted out here in the front garden? What things should they think of when they're planting it? Mine is absolutely in the full sun out there. That's as sunny a spot as it gets in this garden. The sun is on it from 8 in the morning when it comes up above apartment across the road, and it is in the sun until 3 in the afternoon every day, probably even longer now that it's taller. It's in the sun. But again, its roots are shaded. So there's that fence that I have along the front of the garden out here is shading the roots until 11 or so. Now the tree is tall enough to shade its own roots from the top down. And so again, keep in mind, a lot of these plants don't mind sun on the top if they have shade on their own, if they have shade on their roots. And so that's the strategy I've used on it. I think everybody would say that it needs to be in the part sun. Mine's in the full sun, but the roots are in the shade. And so that's how I've done it. It's got turf on one side, fence on the other. It's now big enough that it's shading its own roots. There's some perennials planted around it. There's a hibiscus planted behind it. So it's got that thing I'm talking about where I'm planting tight initially, and that's allowing some intermixing of shade and sun things that if you came to this garden, it might just confuse you. How something that would be listed for full sun is sitting next to something that should be in the shade, but its roots are shaded. Okay, let's see. So a couple other things real quick before I wrap this up. Something that I haven't mentioned on the channel, but his name came up this past week. Somebody was talking about their favorite videos of ours are ones we're on the road, touring gardens, talking to plant breeders and those kind of videos. And they specifically brought up Tom Cox. We were there at the end of last year, spent a couple days at Tom Cox Arboretum, the Cox Arboretum there in Canton, Georgia. Tom passed away 3 or 4 weeks ago. If you go back and look at that video from November, he was as enthusiastic as ever about his incredible conifer garden. He wrote a book on conifers for the Southeast, conifers and ginkgos for the Southeast with Dr. Reuter down at University of Georgia. I'm going to go down there and pretty soon, in the next week or two, I'm doing a filming with Dr. Reuter on some plants that he's introduced recently, and I'm sure we'll get into a conversation about Tom and his enthusiasm for, all things conifers and ginkgos and other things. I wasn't able to go to the funeral. I had a couple other things going on. But for those of you who've, followed the channel, Tom's, will be, dearly missed. And those of us in horticulture, his name has, always, any conversation you're having about, conifers, enthusiasm for what we do, those kinds of things, Tom's name is always, on the list of people that people talk fondly of in this business. So I just wanted to address that because I hadn't said it. And, again, it was about 3 or 4 weeks ago now. And back in November is when that video went up, if you want to go back and look at the video we did at the Cox Arboretum. And then lastly, for this week, I think we did about 20 questions. I do have a new t-shirt linked down below, and it's just... it just says ACEAE, which is the last 5 letters on plant family names. So it's a total plant nerd shirt. No one's going to know what it means except other plant nerds, and I kind of like t-shirts like that. But people that do know what it means will be, where did you get that shirt? That's what I'm hoping for. So things like Asteraceae, it ends with these 5 letters, and Lamiaceae, which is the mint family. Again, so that's the shirt. It's linked down, should be linked down below the videos as you're watching them on the channel if you're interested in a t-shirt. Thank you guys for following along. You can ask gardening questions down below this video for next week's Q&A video. Hopefully this week all of our annual things are going to go in the ground and we're going to make real progress. I've got pots laying everywhere. I brought the camera up here, but this entire space is filled with plants too. There's flats down below the camera that are ready to go in the ground. So hopefully that's this week. Thanks for watching.